German Chancellor Angela Merkel predicted, with the help of the international community, that Europe is set to see thousands upon thousands of individuals coming into Europe from Syria. But these numbers were at 800,000 individuals, which is far more than many European nations can handle in terms of infrastructure, thus creating a problem. Because of the influx of people, many nations are jockeying for position in how to compensate for the fact these people are coming whether they want them to or not. The New York Times points out on September 29th of 2015 that the United States President Barack Obama sees two big issues with the Syrian refugee crisis. The first issue is having human rights established in compensating for the influxes of new people in countries. And the second issue is anti-terrorism. Because the fact is, for many migrants, while they may not be seeing good things at home in Syria, the fact is it may look more appealing to, instead of trying to beat the jihadist groups, join them. But in Syria, where it's nearly impossible to see who the perpetrator of crime is, as opposed to the government or the jihadist group, it creates a conflict of interest for many individuals. But most of them are deciding to leave, creating issues for the international community. Thus, it is imperative we ask today's question: how should the international community respond to the Syrian refugee crisis? And the answer is to simply put in reforms and add aid in unison. They can do this first, by solving for xenophobia in Europe and helping to incorporate refugees into society. Second, by reforming the unnecessary laws that are capping immigration reform. And finally, by making the places that the refugees are going to more appealing to them by solving for human rights in the refugee camps. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has made it a pivotal goal of hers in the next several years to solve for xenophobia throughout Europe, as it has set a precedent with the many nationalist groups that are trying to keep out migrants. But this is the first way that the international community can solve for the Syrian refugee crisis, by having an international precedent set to battle against xenophobia and incorporate refugees into society. The Harvard Political Review explains on September 13th of 2015 that many European nations are at their breaking point in the fact that they cannot simply keep out refugees as long, thus creating many issues, including the rise of many nationalist groups that are incredibly racist towards the Syrian refugee crisis, Syrian refugees coming into their nation. This creates a conflict of interest for many countries as they're trying to divide between international peace or the wealth and the satisfaction of the current citizens. But as Bloomberg points out on September 4th of 2015, that many Syrian refugees can see this, and it's because of that that they're going, instead of going to the bordering nations such as Poland and Austria and Hungary, they're going all the way up to Europe, going all the way up to Germany rather, creating an issue for the German infrastructure because their camps and their precedents can only go so far in the face of 800,000 individuals. Thus, if the international community was to set a precedent towards anti-racism and establish movements to encourage refugees to come into their nations and welcome them, it would mean significant things for solving for the Syrian refugee crisis, as it may not be such a bad thing. But more importantly, in fact, it's imperative to understand that many nations aren't accepting people to begin with. As CNN points, this is the second way that the international community can solve for the Syrian refugee crisis, by fixing the laws and reforming unnecessary laws against immigration reform. CNN points out on September 9th of 2015 that although rich countries in the Middle East, such as the United Arab Emirates, are putting towards money for the Syrian refugee crisis, there's two big key issues with the money. First of all, $530 million may seem like a lot of money as promoted by the United Arab Emirates, but it's not enough to solve significantly for the immigration crisis. And secondly is the fact that many of these countries, although they're giving money, aren't accepting individuals into their highly developed infrastructures. And the fact is, they may have the only significant infrastructure in order to compensate for the influx of people. And because of this, it is clear that Europe is seeing too many individuals coming into their nations, and this has created a conflict of interest for them. But as the Telegraph points out, on September 19th of 2015, that although the anti-sentiment has gone towards European refugees, it is imperative to see them as not only a source of new population, but also as an economic factor, as they could be promoting many things that would be beneficial to the dwindling labor forces in European nations. The Wall Street Journal points out on September 29th of 2015 that the best way they can do this is by utilizing Syrian refugees and incorporating into their labor forces. And doing this could first benefit the Syrian refugee crisis, and the refugees will have an established way of life in the places that they're going to. And the second benefit to this is actually benefiting European economies and international economies as a whole, thus international benefit. But the final thing that is imperative to realize is that even when Syrian refugees are welcomed into nations, many of the treatment that they're getting in the nations aren't necessarily better than some of the treatment they're getting at home. This is the third way that the international community can solve for the Syrian refugee crisis, by fixing these outstanding issues in the camps that they're going to. BBC points out on September 11th of 2015 that while Hungary has many refugee camps within their nation, the fact is the human rights atrocities in the refugee camps almost parallel the treatment of individuals that they're getting back at home in Syria, as they're treating them like animals. And while the European Union has put forth several $1 million towards refugee camps in Europe, the fact is this is only enough to compensate for about 5,400 refugees. So the fact is there needs to be an international precedent set towards compensating for these individuals in camps, but giving them also the human rights that they deserve and allowing them to not only spend the rest of their lives in camps, but move towards incorporation into society as a whole. Thus, this would be incredibly beneficial to the human rights aspect of the Syrian refugee crisis, but also to the aspect of people compensating. Because it's clear that not only are these individuals coming fast, but they're coming to stay. So in returning to today's question, how should the international communities respond to the Syrian refugee crisis? And the answer is clear that they need to make reforms that would be meaningful, and they need to do so in unison. They can do this first, by solving for the xenophobia and incorporating individuals in society. Second, by getting rid of the outstanding laws and reforms that are detrimenting refugees as a whole. And finally, they can do this by allowing better camps for the refugees to go to and allowing them to incorporate into society and move on further. And so because of this, although 800,000 people is a small estimate in the millions of individuals that are expected to come from Syria in years to come, it is clear that if we learn to solve for it now, it will prove less issues in the future.